your essay. Um, when you do the actual essay, you should organize that, as a Word file. It should be double spaced in 12-point font. You should use standard margins and have page numbers on each page. That's what you're going to actually turn in with the actual tables you create embedded into the text where they're being discussed. That section, the data description section should, apply summary statistics, tables, headings, and include a 3-page narrative, which is about 750 words, describing the data that you're examining. And so when you write this data description, make sure that you have headings for each section, and I outline below what those sections should contain. You should create original tables and insert them into the actual essay you write. And again, it's about a 3-page narrative that goes along with those tables, kind of discussing the data and what your conclusions and planning recommendations are that grow out of it. And again, that essay should be divided into 3 sections with appropriate section headings. So it's important to have these sections divided up and easy to understand. The first section should simply contain a brief paragraph that describes the data source and the purpose of the analysis. The second section should present your data in table form and then summarize and analyze the data in a written essay form. And then the last section should include planning recommendations that grow out of that data discussion. And they should factor in regional differences that you identify in your data analysis. And so you're going to create 2 tables for this particular assignment. And one will look at the overall patterns in the data, and the other will divide them into groups for comparison. Now, when you create the tables, they should include, appropriate headings and footnote the source of the data. And the tables, like I said, should be inserted directly into the text adjacent to parts of the narrative where they're discussed. Another thing to keep in mind is that you're not just cutting and pasting SPSS output into the report, but you'll use the output you generate to select the appropriate information to then put into original tables that will be organized and formatted in a way that would be a final way to display the data. And I give you some examples of what those tables should look like in terms of a general boilerplate and template at the end of these instructions. Now, when you do the assignment, I'm going to scroll down a little bit. You should use the pubhouse19.save dataset that's in this assignment folder on UB Learns to generate the output for the assignment. And what's in this particular data set is data for U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development public housing projects from the 2019 Picture of Subsidized Households data set. And so you have basically a census of all of the public housing units and the residents who live in them that's part of this data set. And I'll go over the data set in a few minutes and kind of show you how the data looks in SPSS and also how the codebook looks so that you can select and define different variables that are in the data set. But most of the data should be very easy to interpret. It's very similar to census data. It reports demographic and income and other characteristics of individuals who live in public housing. Like I said, you should create 2 tables using that data. The first should summarize the overall characteristics of households in public housing across the United States. And then you should create a new variable that groups those states into regions. And I have examples of, how those groupings might look. And you should create a second table then comparing the characteristics of households across the regions that you identify. And so you'll have 2 tables, one for the overall aggregate characteristics of all public housing, and the other comparing public housing between different regions that you're examining. Now your table, again, should have clear headings, variable names, identify the source of the data. And when you create the tables, you should pick about 8 or 10 variables that capture key characteristics of households and public housing. And you should use the same variables in both tables you create. And in some cases, you might decide to recode or transform some of the variables. Obviously, you'll need to do that to create the regions, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes when I show you the data set. But there might be other situations where you want to create other summary statistics, and I'll highlight a couple of examples where you might pursue that. But how you do that really depends on what variables you select and the extent to which you need to do any recoding. Now, the assignment's due at 10:30 a.m. on October 15th. That's 2 weeks from now, and you should submit it online using the link to this assignment in the assignment folder. And I'll show you that in a second when I close out this particular screen. And just keep in mind that you should turn in 2 separate Word files. One is the actual essay that you write, and the second is the SPSS output that you generate for the assignment. And so when you generate your output, whether it's in SPSS or PSPP, you should save it as a Word file, and then keep that so that when you submit your assignment, you can submit the data that you generated, so that, you know, if questions come up as the grading is being done on the tables and some of the information that you provide, we can reference back to the data from the SPSS output and see if, you know, any issues arose in terms of recoding, you know, if you didn't, you know, record the information from the output the same as it appeared in tables, things of that nature, just to kind of like reverse engineer any problems that might emerge in terms of kind of understanding what information you're providing in the assignment you submit. Now, there's a couple of rules with all of the assignments in class, and they have to do with when you can, you know, collaborate with other students in the class and what you need to kind of work on independently. And it's a very simple rule. When you're working with SPSS and generating output for your exercises, you are welcome to collaborate on that part of the assignment. And so if you have kind of study groups or friends in the class or other groupings that you've created where you can kind of work on the SPSS output together, that is allowed. You are allowed to kind of work collaboratively on actually generating the data output for your assignment. But when you develop the actual descriptive sections and you create your tables and you write up your results in the essay, that all should be done independently. And so, you know, that's how the two things relate to one another. So just keep that in mind. And of course, if you have questions about when you can collaborate and what you should be working on independently, you know, always ask myself or Michaela so that we can give you a quick answer before, you know, you go down the wrong road in any particular, you know, activity you're working on. But also, you're perfectly welcome to do everything independently as well. And so it really depends on, you know, how you organize your work and get prepared to write the essays. Now, on the second page,
Professor,
yes.
question. Do you want us to identify who we've collaborated with to produce the outputs?
No, you don't have to do that. But you know, when we teach this class in person, obviously you're in lab. You know, when we're doing these types of lab sessions, and you know, people kind of organically, you know, find their neighbors who might be, you know, able to help them with, you know, debugging something in the SPSS program or working on the output generation, things of that nature. And so, you know, online, if you've created some type of way to kind of contact and reach out to other people in the class, that also probably happens organically. So you don't have to kind of disclose what happens within that black box to me. I just want the actual output that you generated so that I can see what you're drawing from when you're creating your tables and doing the other independent work that you're working on.
Can I interrupt for 1 second, Dr. Silverman?
Sure.
We have a couple of questions in the chat, and I also just want to provide one clarification. when we say submit the output, does everybody understand what that means? We've gone through that a couple times within SPSS and PSPP of kind of that separate window that you can then export the output from. If you don't remember that, it's in previous labs. It's different in PSPP and SPSS. In SPSS, you'll be able to export a Word file. In PSPP, you'll be able to export a TXT file. We accept both.
Right.
They won't be formatted in a nice, pretty way. You don't have to spend time formatting your output before you submit it. Dr. Silverman and I are used to reading outputs in SPSS and PSPP, so we'll be able to quickly kind of skim the weird format that it submits in. So don't worry about making any changes to that export. That's just a export command, and then whatever file you get, upload that to Blackboard. The other question that I've been getting is, are students able to select which regions they choose to separate, whether you have 4 regions, 5 regions? We've gotten a couple questions with whether or not you can choose other forms of regions, like electoral boundaries. All of that, I think, is okay, but I'll double check with Dr. Silverman that if you want to choose kind of a grouping of regions that's not one of the examples given, is that okay, Dr. Silverman?
Yes, and let me go back to the first question. Yeah, when you submit your output, yeah, it's perfectly fine to submit a text file if you're kind of extracting that from PSPP. That will open up, in a text format, or you can actually open those up in Word as well. But the idea behind submitting these things as Word files or text files is that those files are small in a relative sense compared to other ways that we download this data. And like Michaela said, it doesn't have to be cleaned up and put in a pristine format. We know what that output looks like when it's generated in the computer software, and it's, again, just so we can go back and look at the output and identify any issues in terms of transferring the information into your final tables. So what Michaela said is absolutely spot on, and so keep that in mind. In terms of selecting regions, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but the same issue that Michaela brought up is accurate as well. Those are examples of regions, but you can divide up the states into different groupings based on what you want to focus on within your analysis. And so there's a lot of flexibility in that way, in terms of how you organize the data too. So just in terms of the second page of the assignment folder, what I've provided you with are a couple of templates as examples of what the actual tables should look like in terms of, basically a boilerplate. And as you can see, in the first table, when you develop your table for the overall characteristics of public housing in the United States, just note, a couple of general parameters for that table. You can see that the variable names and descriptions are clearly presented in the table. Keep in mind that you shouldn't just use the variable name that you find in SPSS, but reference the actual code book so that you get a clear description of what the variable is measuring in that variable name. And you can see that these variable names, do that, in a very kind of, descriptive way. It isn't just saying av, num, pep, if that's what the variable name is in the data set, but it's the average number of people in public housing. There's a column for the mean for each variable and a column for the standard deviation. So you should have those two characteristics of the data provided in your tables. And there's a clear, heading for what the table presents, and the source of the data is presented below as well. And so whenever you're creating tables, you should organize them, using that type of a framework, so that all the basic information that users of your data are looking for is presented in an easy to kind of digest format. And in the second table, it's really just the same information provided, but what you can see is that now there's additional columns for, the regions. And in this case, there's 4 regions: North, Midwest, South, and West. Like you were just, kind of reminded, the number of regional breakdowns, or the regions in your recoded variable is going to depend on, how you organize the data. One thing to just keep in mind when you look at this table is the more regions you create, the busier your table becomes, and in some cases, the more difficult it is to interpret. So I would just suggest that when you do make those regional subdivisions in your data, when you create that recoded variable to split your file by and compare the means across the different groups, you should kind of think about doing that with fewer than more regions. I would even argue that 4 might be more, the most that you want to put in your breakdown with that second comparison, and you can even do as few as 2. And so that's a decision that you're going to make based on what you want to kind of really compare in the data. So before I kind of close this particular window, are there any questions about this much of the assignment so far? And then I'm going to jump into a couple of other things.
I have a question again, just about the rules around collaboration.
Okay.
So we can collaborate on sort of troubleshooting, creating outputs, but when it comes down to selecting what it is that we want to focus on in the data, that needs to be an independent decision. Is that correct?
Yeah, basically once you've generated your output and you get to the point where you're going to be interpreting the results, creating your final tables, writing up your essay, that's all individual work.
Okay.
But yeah, the collaboration is really just to kind of troubleshoot issues with SPSS, bounce ideas or questions off of one another when you're recoding data, and getting your output generated.
Okay.
Can I provide kind of what I did?
Yes.
Collaboration when I was taking the class. So what I did was I kind of identified a couple of other people in the class who wanted to use the same regional categorizations that I did. And then we each did the output in SPSS and PSPP kind of on our own, and then compared the numbers, to make sure that total population in the regions was the same. We collectively selected, I think we were all together interested in 12 different variables. We all just ran the 12 variables, and then we compared and made sure that our numbers were the same. Like the number for standard deviation was the same, the number for the mean was the same. But then once we got to that step, we separated, and interpreting the different means should be individual work, or interpreting the different standard deviations should be individual work. So turning the numbers into words, that's what we want you to do individually, but coming up with the numbers, you can collaborate.
And it was okay that you all had basically the identical list of variables that you were looking at?
Yes.
Thank you. That's clear now.
Okay. So I'm back at the main screen in the assignment folder. And again, I just wanted to highlight the very last item on that screen is the link to actually submit and upload your assignment. And so once you've completed your work and done all of your analysis and have the final format of the assignment in place, then that's the link you click on to upload your assignment to the submission window. And so that's where that link is always going to be located in all of our assignments during the semester. Everything else you see here is, again, the actual, assignment instructions that I just went over, the data set, which I'm going to show you in one moment, the code book for the data set. And then also there are some examples of, how you might divide regions up, under different rubrics. There's a link to the Picture of Subsidized Housing website just to show you where the actual data came from. And then, like I said, the link to upload the assignment. So let me switch over to the actual database in SPSS. And this is the data. I've already opened that data set up. And you can see that the database, has 47 different variables in it. Some of that information is descriptive of what's in the actual data set. Some of it are the measures that you might select from to create your tables. And you can see at the very top, the actual state is listed, and they call it a string variable. That's a variable that's just by name. And then I also have the state's abbreviation. So, NY for New York, CA for California, so on and so forth, in a separate variable. And that will be useful when you actually go to recode and create regions. And I'm going to talk about that in 1 second. But the other data in the data set, and I'm just going to kind of expand these variable labels, are just right now identified by the label that's created for each variable. And so the state abbreviation, the program label, the total units, and so on and so forth are all listed using these names for the variables. Under the labels, those are just the same variable names. And so in order to kind of get a description of the actual data and what each variable represents, you'll need to use the code book, which I have in a PDF file. That's not it. And when you open up the code book, what you'll see is that the variables are kind of listed in this spreadsheet format. And when you kind of scroll down, you can find the variable name, and then it will give you a more detailed description of the data. And so, for instance, some of this is just kind of, descriptive information for the data set itself. For instance, this program label was coded in a number of different ways in the original data set. The only program label you're going to see is public housing. And so, like when I switch back to the SPSS folder, you can see that, the program label is here. And when I go to the data view, now the program label, all the programs are labeled as public housing. That's how it was coded, because I just sorted the public housing units from all the other subsidized housing that's in that bigger data set. When you go back to the code book, what you can see is that, the variable names then, have more detailed data descriptions associated with them. And so when you get to, for instance, total units in the data set, it's the number of units under contract, for federal subsidy and available for occupancy. That's just the total units in that housing project on each row in the database. The percent occupied is just the percent of occupied units as the percent of units available. And each of those variable names that you'll find in the data set has, a description associated with it in this code book. Now, when I created this data set for the class, I didn't include every variable in this that's listed in this code book, but about 3/4 of them are there. And really some of the variables I just left out because they either, were just descriptive information about the database itself, or they were just, breakdowns of larger categories that are more useful for you to select and do the assignment with. And so, there's information on rent and income in the units. And these first two variables are interesting because one, the rent per month is the average, gross household contribution towards rent per month. That's what the tenants pay. And then the spending per month is the average federal spending per unit. That's what the housing authority pays towards the rent. And you could take a variable like that and calculate a ratio. And so you take those raw dollar amounts and then create a ratio of tenant to housing authority contribution, which might be one recoding procedure you might consider using if you decide to include that type of a variable in your analysis. Again, that's your option, but that's just one example of how you could, use these variables to recode them into a more standardized measure to summarize. And so, like when I go back to the data set and you find that variable in the analysis, here it is, rent per month, spending per month, those two variables, these are just the actual average dollar amounts for each of the housing units. And so, like I was saying, if you if you calculated a ratio for those two variables, then you get a standardized measure that you can compare across different cases. And that's the kind of value of doing that kind of recoding. When I go back to the code book, you can see there's a lot of other information just about rent and income, household income, per income, per person, in the household on average. When you scroll down, you'll see that there's other variables that give you measures of the percent of wages that were a major source of household income, or I'm sorry, the percent of households where the majority of household income was derived from wages. The next one is the percent of households where the majority of household income was derived from welfare. And then there's another where income was derived from some other source than wages or welfare. And so you get these other measures that are already standardized for you that give you a sense of where people's income is coming from when they live in public housing. There's median income that's reported for the properties that you're examining. There's some other information about family types and family structure. The percent of units that where the spouse is not present. One adult with children. Female-headed households, the percent of households headed by women with children. There's data on disability status broken down by age in terms of what proportion of units are occupied by people with disabilities. And there's also a data breakdown of households and what their household head is broken down by the age bracket that they fall into. And that kind of, if you scroll down further, you can see you can use those types of variables to identify elderly headed households and households headed by people in other age cohorts if you choose to include that in your data. There's also data on the race of the household head. And there's a number of different iterations of that data, depending on how you want to organize it. And then there is data on what they call the social conditions, tenant, unit, and neighborhood. And you can see there's information on the size of units in the properties. And also in the very end of that particular part of the data set, there is information on the percent of the population below poverty level in the census tract where the property is located. The minorities is a percent of the total population in the census tract where the property is located. And there's also one about home ownership in the census tract where the property is located. So there's a lot of different data that also gives you kind of neighborhood context information about where public housing is located and what types of neighborhoods you find it in. And so, throughout this data set, and then the remainder of, there's a couple other things to also look at. In the last kind of couple of variables in the data set, one's called PHA total units. It gives you the total number of units for the housing authority that the property is managed by. So you can look at, for instance, calculate the proportion of units that property represents compared to the overall kind of inventory of housing that the housing authority manages. Or there's also a variable that it's called housing authority size, which gives you a classification of how large the actual housing authority is that manages a property. And it's broken down by this coding scheme where 1 is agencies with 1 to 99 units, 2 is agencies with 100 to 299 units, and it goes all the way up to the possibility that you might have a housing authority with 30,000 or more units. That's a very small number of housing authorities in the country, but somewhere in the middle, you'll find a majority of the housing units in the country, housing authorities in the country that manage 1,000 to 3,000 properties. And so all of that data is available to use in your analysis. Now, when I go back to the SPSS file, what you'll see is that, again, there are, 47 different variables in this data set. And in actuality, some are just giving you the street address and city and zip code where individual properties are located. And so, it's really about 42 variables that you'll be using potentially in your analysis. But for your tables, you should kind of examine all of the data before you kind of start planning your analysis and think about which variables are the 8 or 10 that you want to focus on when you generate your output. And also, identify any variables you might want to recode to incorporate into your analysis if you decide to go that route. And so that's what the data set looks like. A couple of other things I just want to highlight. The first has to do with recoding these string variables. And so, when I go back up to, the actual data view, what you'll see is that, the state abbreviations are provided for you in a separate variable. Alaska is AK, Alabama is AL. All the different states are listed. And one thing you might want to do as you before you recode this data is just to, print out a frequency distribution of the states. So you have all the different abbreviations in front of you. And so you can go up to analyze and descriptive statistics and frequencies and just, select the state abbreviation and click OK, and it will generate a frequency distribution just so you have them in front of you. You can see also the number of public housing properties in each state. Alaska has 13, Alabama has 231, and the numbers change with every state. And so in alphabetical order now, you have all the state acronyms listed. And that will help you because when you go to recode this variable and create your regions, you might decide that you want to code them, north versus south. And so within that coding scheme, maybe the north would be coded as 1 and the south would be coded as 0. And so you can then, enter each abbreviation and then either code it as a 1 or a 0 based on your coding scheme. If you have a 3 coding scheme, it would be 0, 1, 2, and so on and so forth. But the thing to keep in mind is that when you're recoding these variables, because it's a string variable, you have to enter in the abbreviation for each state. And it's case sensitive in both PSPP and SPSS. So when you go to transform and then recode into a different variable, and you select state abbreviation as your input variable, and whatever your recoded state abbreviation is your new variable, then when you select the old and new values to create that variable, your value for Alaska would be AK in caps, and then your value for the recoded variable, it might be in region 2, and then you'd add it, and you'd have to do that for each subsequent state. So if you then have Alabama and its value is 1, you'd have to, you see how I'm doing that? You're creating a new code for every abbreviation because it's kind of just listed as a name, and you want to make sure that the case, if it's uppercase, it's uppercase in your recoding scheme as well. And I'll just do one more real quick, which is Arkansas. Maybe Arkansas is going to be coded as 0. So once you do that for all of the states in the data set, and you press continue, it will assign those codes and create this new variable for all of those states. And I didn't put all 50 states plus the 3 territories there into the data set, but I just want to show you kind of what the output looks like when you start to recode like that. So I did the recoding. I'm going to go back to my data view. And when you scroll to the end of the data set, here is this recoded variable. And you can see, that there are now some coded as 2, that's Alaska, some coded as 1, that's Alabama. And when I keep scrolling down, there are a lot of Alabama properties. Zeros are Arkansas. And because I didn't complete the coding, anything that doesn't get a code assigned to it ends up being reported as a missing case. It's got a dot there, and it won't be included in your analysis. And so, one way to kind of make sure that your data is accurate is you can, again, print out another frequency distribution for the new variable. And if you have missing cases, you know that something didn't get included into your coding scheme. And you might want to go back and do that recoding again to make sure you have all the information in your final variable that you'll then use when you go to data and then split file and then organize your output by groups and compare groups by that new variable you created to generate your output for the second table you're going to create with those groups taken into consideration. And so just keep that in mind when you're recoding that, again, that these variables, these names are just listed as names in the data set and they're case sensitive. And so you have to, reproduce them in the same way they appear in the data set when you do the recoding. Don't use lowercase numbers or they just simply won't identify them. The other thing to keep in mind about the data, and I want to go back to just that little output window I created, is that, there are a total of 53 different abbreviations or different states listed in this particular data set. And that's because there is a state listed as DC, which is the District of Columbia. And so that territory of the US has its own identifier. So properties in the District of Columbia are also included in this data set. If you do your recoding, you're only looking at the 50 states. Make sure that you code DC in a special way or don't assign a code to it so that you can exclude it from your data set. You also might want to deselect that particular case in your analysis if you only want to look at the 50 states. There's another one, GU, that's Guam. There are 4 public housing properties in Guam that are included in this data set. And then there's another one, PR. Where's my P's? There it is. That's Puerto Rico. And so there are, the 50 states plus the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and Guam that are in this data set. When you're doing your coding, assigning regions, keep that in mind as a consideration and make the decision about how you'll treat those territories. If you'll keep them in your database or exclude them for your analysis based on how you create those regions. And so that's something to also be aware of in the data. I think there was one other thing. No, that was it. And so that's the data that you'll be using for this assignment.
Can I have one more clarification question that's coming up?
Yes.
So we're all on the same page that you can include all states and non-states that are included in the data set, or you can exclude non-states and just include states. Is it also possible to exclude some states, say if you only want to focus on the East Coast?
Well, when you're creating the regions, I guess the question is if you just wanted to compare, states like east of the Mississippi to each other, that would be okay if you could make a good rationalization for that. When you create that second table, I'm sure people who live in Colorado and New Mexico and California might take offense at the fact that they were thrown out of the data set, just like people in Puerto Rico or Guam or DC might. But the point is, if you can make the argument for why you did that, and then go on with your sub-analysis, that's okay for this assignment. But as a general rule of thumb, try to keep as much of the data, in that second part of the analysis as makes sense for what you're trying to, compare. There might be some examples, I'll show you one in 1 second, where just the 50 states, make the most sense for a certain way of dividing up the data. In other cases, regions, might include, DC, Puerto Rico, and Guam. If you're looking at kind of, east of the Mississippi, west of the Mississippi. Well, we know that, Guam and Hawaii and Alaska all would be in that western side of the country, and Puerto Rico would be on the eastern side. So you can kind of fit everything in there. So it really just depends on, how you're dividing up the data and what you're trying to kind of express in your second table. But I guess it would be possible if you just wanted to kind of focus on 25 of the 50 states for some reason, and then divide them into 2 groups that you could do that, but or even 3 groups, but kind of try to make a good logical assessment about why you're making those decisions in terms of dividing up the data. And here's an example of what I was talking about. I have some kind of maps that kind of show different ways of dividing up, the states by regions or subdivisions. And so, one map, provides you with the way to do that, where you just have 2 categories. And these are the red state and blue state election maps for the last presidential election. So, we're in a presidential cycle right now, and maybe you'll want to, do comparisons of public housing populations, between red states and blue states, during the last election, looking at how those populations look when you kind of compare those 2 groupings. Again, these are kind of not really regional, but it's another way of subdividing the data. And that could make for, an interesting discussion if you start to find, very clear distinctions between that way of subdividing the data. And so that's one way, but it's also an example where, this electoral, vote map wouldn't include DC, Puerto Rico, and Guam, because they don't have electoral votes. So in that case, it makes sense, to exclude, some of the geographic areas, from the analysis. And so, depending on how you decide to divide up the map, will really kind of guide you to making decisions about how to, organize the data. And actually, in this case, I see DC is on this map. So maybe because it's here, you would keep it. I don't see Guam or Puerto Rico on this map. And so that's one of the maps. I thought I had more of them open. Let me just pull another one up. There's another way of dividing up the map by, regions, which is similar to what I had shown you. Can you see that region map I just pulled up? Central, Northeast, West, South. So, here's another example I have on the UB Learn site, which shows you kind of a regional breakdown for the data. And so you can, kind of make decisions about, how to organize that recoded variable for regions that you're going to create the second table with, based on a lot of different references. There's one I have that looks at time zones. There's another one that examines the data, into a more a larger group of regions. You might consolidate some of these regions in your analysis in some ways, but the point is that you should, kind of select, some type of way of creating comparisons that then you can kind of inform your analysis with, and think about what variables you want to look at, and what kinds of differences you want to examine across those subdivisions within the data set. So are there any questions about the assignment before I split the class into 2 groups at this point? And obviously there are going to be more opportunities